All right. Well, thank you for joining us and sharing a really smart ethnographic account of this wild goose chase, as well as a couple of really timely articles about related things in mainland China. And yeah, as we start out, maybe do you just want to say something about this article, how it relates to your broader work, and you know, how you sort of are understanding the current moment.
Sure, sure. Can you hear me okay? When we were just talking one-on-one, it was fine, but okay. Yeah, so this article is actually part of a book which is now coming out this fall, which is a broader look at the project of trying to sort of identify, scientific global health project to identify the ecological epicenter of pandemic influenza viruses in China. And there's, part of that story is sort of a geopolitical story about the relationship of China and the US during the Cold War to now, during one period of time in which China was excluded from the WHO, so there was problems with collaboration because of that. But then the more relevant issue is really about how from the 2000s, during the 2000s, as the H5N1 influenza virus reemerged, there was a kind of movement of research led by veterinary global health workers, mostly led by the Food and Agriculture Organization in collaboration with Chinese veterinary agencies, to really do more than just try to identify sort of the viruses and analyze and sampling the viruses that cause these viruses, but actually to try to understand some of the ecological conditions that drive the emergence of pandemic flu viruses. And yeah, so that's what I was looking at, sort of this shift towards, shift from looking at viruses towards looking at the context, the ecological context that drive the emergence of viruses. And what I tried to show partly in this article is that when they do that, of course, it brings into play a lot of issues about the other kind of actors in the world who are shaping these ecologies, and how the scientists can try to study these ecologies. You can't just study them in a kind of abstracting them from their social contexts, but you actually have to get very engaged into those social contexts. And then I guess I would just say, as a transition to understanding with this current pandemic, which is not an influenza pandemic, right? Is caused by coronavirus. One of the things that is interesting to me about that is that there's been a lot of claims about the fact that, the virus came from wild animals, came from the Wuhan seafood market, where there were wild animals sold. But a lot of the evidence for those claims, a lot of those claims are based on virological evidence, basically. So the idea that it's from a bat reservoir is from the phylogenetic assessment of the similarity between this virus and a previously isolated and archived bat coronavirus. And what's been missing completely in the story here is that there's not a lot of knowledge about what are the ecological conditions that might have been creating the interface between animals and humans. And so we have this huge absence there, which has led to a lot of, on the one hand, some kind of racist and misguided ideas about markets and the role that markets might have played, which seems to be turning out to be maybe inaccurate, and calls for a total ban on wildlife trade, which includes things such as things that might be, of course, some might be risk factors, but there's other things like frogs or something which are also being caught up in those bans and actually don't play any role in the driving of this kind of viruses. So I guess I think one of the articles I sent, I'll just finish with this, that the one about human-animal interactions and coronavirus spillover, that article shows one attempt at trying to identify some sort of social ecological conditions that was driving the interface of coronaviruses. But it's, to me, interesting that, and I think it's because of the fact that influenza has been in a kind of a livestock disease for a long time, that there's been a serious, significant amount of research on the ecological conditions of influenza viruses and much less about coronaviruses. It's been much more focused on sampling viruses and much less on the kind of understanding those ecological conditions.
One of the things that really stood out to me about this essay is you're exploring how scientists come to know new things. Towards the very end, you say this essay proposes an anthropological investigation into the diverse routes along which scientists adjust the research objects and come to know new things. And as you were just talking about, you know, all the presumptions about wet markets, all the presumptions about bats with the current virus, in many ways, like what we're seeing is a science that knew some things, you know, knew things about bat coronaviruses because of these earlier histories of science, but has been kind of slow to come to know new things in the context of the specificity of this particular outbreak. And I was just curious to see how you're thinking about like those constraints on knowing new things in the current moment.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, again, I think that with influenza as well, the initial ecological claims about influenza viruses and their emergence actually come out of virological research in laboratories. And so it was initially because of the fact that you could show that the reassortment of influenza viruses happens when, that you can experimentally show that reassortment of two different strains from different species, like a pig influenza and an avian influenza, they can be reassorted in a petri dish or in a live animal, experimental animal. It's because of that research that they then, that's where claims about the fact that, oh, it must be the relationships between these species in real life that's actually leading to the emergence of new strains. And it's only after sort of the 2000s that you get a shift towards actually trying to understand what those contexts actually might be like. Before that, it's really this kind of very sort of anecdotal claims about what like Chinese farms are like, where there's, you know, just describing them in a very kind of anecdotal way without actually what I would describe as developing an experimental system to study that. The experimental systems are all virological focused. And so, yeah, I think that what's happening here, it's not just that there's been slow to pick up, but that there's been a massive investment that's been very successful on the virological front, like almost incredibly successful, I think, in terms of their ability to quickly identify this virus, show all of its relationships, because they had a background of having sampled all those viruses and archiving them. But there hasn't been, we don't have the knowledge of sort of like, what are the, except for maybe this one article, but what are the kind of interactions that might have been happening? What are the trade routes that might have been bringing animals into Wuhan? Like, why is it when everyone thought it would be in southern China, why is it in Wuhan? Things like that. So.
And I mean, there's tons of interesting stuff in here, but it's also particularly interesting to me to see that the scientists are seeing nature culture. Like this is kind of their, like at the same moment almost that anthropology is having its discovery of like, oh, we can do nature culture like in our own field work. It seems like there's kind of a parallel zeitgeist almost, or how influential do you think this is in epidemiology, virology at this moment?
Well, it's definitely a around influenza and then the One Health type movements. It's definitely a very predominant movement, I would say, to think about. I think because I think was sort of the thing about when you start thinking about pandemics coming from animals and livestock farming, it raised a lot of questions about what are those practices like. And countless times when I was at sort of maybe FAO meetings, my daughter's here, that people would say, oh, you're an anthropologist, like we need to clone that guy. We need more of these. So there's a kind of demand for it. And sometimes it becomes maybe the kind of sort of nature culture that they're doing is maybe wouldn't look right to us as anthropologists or something. It's maybe overly simplified, but I think there is an understanding of that absence.
I would love to hear more, just like your as a participant observer of like these two different nature cultures, or like the multi-species conversation and like the scientific version of nature culture. Like, how is that figured, and what's kind of within the parameters of you know, like how what's the ethnographic slot for some of these interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research teams?
Mm-hmm. I'm not totally sure I understand your question. You mean to compare the or how they position culture within their system?
Yeah, and our capacity, yeah, like what's the slot of the ethnographer, and has that been expanded at all?
It's a really good question. So I think that, so in an earlier moment, I think that there was when it was more of an anecdotal, as I was describing, and which is still, I think, maybe a predominant for some laboratory researchers, then culture is really marked as tradition, as past, and the fringe. It's about the edges. It's about the peripheries. It's about and it kind of, almost like a, what's critiqued in Fabian's work or something, is like a kind of putting the other. It becomes a representation of past, but also as a representation of future, because that's where the viruses might be coming from. So there's a sort of a strange tradition as being where the future might be coming from. But I think maybe there's efforts. I think they're interested and open to other ways of thinking. Let me think of another frame that they use often is something like stakeholders. So that's probably something you might be familiar from, like ecological, environmental assessment and stuff. And it's the same with the veterinary One Health work, that to understand humans and their interactions with other species, we understand it through stakeholders and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I also loved kind of the genealogy. We heard about some of these figures through when we read Fred Frederick's book, but Robert Webster, who's doing some of these multi-species experiments, generating recombinant viral forms, and then that kind of goes into the field and gets torqued and morphed, and yeah, maybe if you could say a little bit more about these. I mean, it's kind of, you're doing sort of a history of knowledge, a history of science situated in this ethnographic context. So how do we, maybe if you could say more about these intellectual genealogies, but also how we know basic things about recombinant life with viruses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the narrative that I try to present is what I describe here as displacement, I guess. And in my book, I do a little bit more of a historical portion that's not in here, in which I look at how Kennedy Shortridge, who Frederick also has been working on, I think, based in Hong Kong, developed these models for understanding the role of free-grazing ducks in the emergence of pandemic flu viruses. And sort of, he was the first to really isolate the free-grazing duck as the key figure, a key figure in driving the emergence of pandemic flu viruses. And he did that basically by showing that if you sampled flu viruses in southern China, you almost every single type of every single antigen subtype could be found in ducks. And so you would find a few occasional subtypes in chickens or things like that, but if you could find almost every subtype in ducks. So that's indicated their sort of reservoir then what I show is how later after 2004, the fact that H5N1 became almost an endemic situation in Southeast Asia, you had a movement towards research on understanding some of the ecological conditions, as I was saying. And what's interesting is that they confirm precisely the same claim of the fact that free-raising ducks play a key role. But they do that using an entirely different kind of experimental system. So I tried to chart sort of how that movement to the field happens like that. And then again, in this article, is what I was trying to show is that the next step from that is that, which is once you start then incorporating the field, there then needs to be a displacement towards this almost anthropological engagement with the other practitioners making the environments.
Yeah, and then they're confronted with this strange space where wildness is fabricated in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah. And so they're models of what counts as a key site for surveillance and observation, which would be this interface of wild and domestic, becomes problematic. And when they realize that they're the kind of the amount of this wild animal farming, wild geese farming.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, and it seems like so you're in dialogue with Warwick Anderson. We're going to have him share either that piece that you cite or some of his writing on coronavirus in the next couple of weeks. And it seems like this. I mean, you could almost simplify some of these ecologically minded epidemiological models that have that deeply rooted history that Warwick describes of like changing ecological relations equals disease emergence. So you write, the concept of disease emergence proposes that the changing ecological relationships are responsible for the production of new diseases from HIV to Ebola. Citing Stephen Morse, who coined the term, disease emergence is the transfer of disease-causing pathogens into novel host populations. Viral traffic then becomes a special object of infectious disease research. So there's all kinds of interesting things. Like for starters, I didn't know that that's where this idea came from, disease emergence. Emergence is something I've thought a lot about, but didn't really critically think about the origin of the term. But it seems interesting. A lot of this literature seems to be focusing on like these local milieu, these spaces on sort of the periphery of the modern world system, rather than the industrial assemblages, the transportation infrastructures, the capitalist enterprises that are, the conditions of possibility for a pandemic, in my mind, found in these local milieu.
Right.
But it's these broader assemblages. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on as to why kind of the changes get localized, I guess, as I'm kind of reading this literature.
Mm-hmm. Really good point. Yeah. So that's some of the researchers that I was following in China, internationally, and some Chinese, the kind of lead group that I was following, it turned out they were sort of going exactly in a direction that you're calling for. In the last couple of years, they've started to move towards, because what they did is they took these ecological sort of metaphoric, to use Warwick Anderson's terms, metaphoric claims about ecology, turned them into an analytic using these spatial techniques like satellite imagery, other kinds of population models, and building these spatial models across a landscape. And what they've done in the last couple of years is turn those into planetary scale. And so you can look at planetary scale models of influenza. And what they did with that is, instead of looking for the source, so instead of looking for this site of emergence, like a localization, they instead turned it into looking for what they call suitability. And so you look at what are the sites that would be suitable, that are at risk for transmission of like a H5 influenza virus. And and what they find is that tracks mostly along with not only generally anthropogenic factors, rather than sort of say like landscape or like climatological or regional factors. So it's not geographic, it's anthropogenic. And more specifically, it's with density of poultry, basically, and with industrial. So it more tracks with industrial type farming rather than some kind of local cultural characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Are they looking at also like commodity chains and like global transportation infrastructures, or is that kind of outside of the purview of a planetary ecological imaginary?
There's people definitely working on that, but not so much the ones that are people that are focused on the animal area. So the researchers focused on the animals haven't turned to that, which actually might be a major blindness, I would say, because from what I know, and maybe others maybe know more about this, but the 2009 H1N1, which emerged out of North America US/Mexico, unclear exactly where it emerged, but apparently the reason was because of transports of pig populations between Europe, North America, and Asia, sort of that a mixing happened because of large-scale transports of pigs. So I think, for example, what there have been research on sort of human travel and how that might be able to model the way a pandemic would spread, but I'm not sure there's been the same research on animal transport and how that might be leading to things.
So other folks should feel free to jump in, just unmute yourself and ask questions. I also have lots of questions about the primary literature that you shared with us. So maybe before I delve into that, I want to see if other folks have questions for you about your piece. Frederick, did you just jump in?
Can you hear?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, Lyle. I'm curious about the articles that you sent on bat coronaviruses. So they've been published before the COVID-19, right? So I imagine there's the first question is how you came to select these two articles. I imagine there's a wide literature on bat coronaviruses before COVID-19, and it's going to expand now. And the question I ask myself is there the equivalent for bat research, bat virology, of what you have identified in Poyang Lake or what I have identified in Hong Kong, which you can describe as sentinel post or as territories where, or as hotspots, right? As territories where the density and the specificity of relations between humans and animals makes them interesting sites of emergence and interesting sites of surveillance. We're writing an article with Arnaud Morvan currently on bat virology, and we have identified spots in Ghana and also in Australia. Australia is not a space of surveillance of bat coronaviruses because it's so big, but it's probably one of the places where bat virology has started because of the Hendra case outbreak in 1994. And from what I know, following bat virologists who are kind of Chinese Australian, they have focused on Malaysia because of the Nip outbreak, right? So I know that they collect a lot of bat viruses in Malaysia. So I'm thinking of Ghana and Malaysia as two interesting sites where there's a lot of bat sampling. I'm also thinking, of course, of Yunnan, where a lot of these people were working in Wuhan, who have now become infamous globally, are working. But do you have an idea about that? Just looking at the articles quickly, I couldn't find exactly where they were, where the sampling was made. But so what is your idea of the kind of hotspots or sentinel spots of bat virology?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think these articles are both based on researching Guangxi or Guangdong, and also, but it's but as you said, Yunnan also. So they have, those have been the major research areas. And they've isolated large numbers of coronaviruses as well from bats, as well as this research, which the first one, which is the human-animal interactions one, I was just interested that they'd actually tried to do some kind of social ecological research in conjunction with the sampling there, which is, I think, is what I feel has been done quite extensively with influenza, but has not been done so extensively with coronaviruses. But yeah, they all, and it's, from what I've read, Peter Dadzak, and when they saw this outbreak happen, they did say, we thought it would happen in Guangxi or Guangdong. They didn't think it would happen in Wuhan. So they have no, how did it, that's the big mystery here.
We had a virologist talk to the group maybe about 2 months ago now, and he says the reason that the outbreak was first reported in Wuhan is because there's a critical mass of virology experts in Wuhan. So it could have been circulating amongst people for a long time, and then
it's an interesting point, yeah, because there's different arguments that are made about that. There's the conspiracy theory type argument,
right?
There's the fact that market, and even though that market has been pretty much ruled out, but there is a possibility of massive amounts of trade going through Wuhan because it's quite central as a central trade point as well. So when FAO did research on influenza and the role of poultry markets in driving influenza viruses, they actually did find that markets in the central states, so like Hunan and Hubei, they actually were significant within the network of markets within the whole country of China. Mm-hmm. So there's a possibility there. And then the other is that there's just the possibility that they were able to detect it, and that because the samples were sent from the hospital, they were quite quickly sent to the top virology research center. So that is cool.
So this paper that you shared with us on human-animal interactions, the conclusion was kind of startling, which is that rural lifestyles are a clear and present danger. It says exposure likely occurs through the daily or normal practices of rural communities rather than specific high-risk behaviors like wild animal hunting. Considering the proven potential of some SARS-CoVs currently circulating in bats in southern China to infect human cells, cause clinical signs in humanized mouse models, blah. This represents a clear and present danger to our biosafety and public health. So it's really, that was a really interesting moment in this paper where, it's like the apparatus of scientific knowledge is identifying sort of the alter modes of the not quite modern as the kind of threat to civilization. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on how they've kind of framed their conclusions.
I mean, I wanted to highlight this article because I think that it's one of the few that even attempts this kind of raising the question of something beyond just the virus itself. Mm-hmm. But it does seem like it has some fairly large weaknesses in terms of how they did the survey. One major one for me is that they used influenza-like illness as they grouped that was their sign point for what would be counted as something that would be like associated with then the risk factors. Mm-hmm. But of course, influenza, it could be influenza. It's just so broad. It's hard for me to see how that actually can be a useful evidence for the risk factor assessment. But because they couldn't find, they did find people who had antibodies to coronaviruses, which is in one sense incredible. Yeah. On the other hand, though, they couldn't find any correlation with specific risk factors from that. So I'm not sure about the specific findings, because as you said, it's sort of like they found no finding and then they just turned it into, it means that everyday life in living in rural China in around this area, this region is just dangerous or something. So
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a really interesting mixed methods paper, and but yeah, you know, they admit to their own kind of poor taxonomic. So you know, it was like, I think rodents and shrews were kind of one category of animal, and then there was like the predators, which, and I don't know how this sits in Chinese folk taxonomy, but it seemed like that was like the small animals versus like the predatory animals. But it would be like really interesting to do, you know, for us to do some kind of mixed methods, like a smarter, you know, like let's find a scientist to collaborate with, and you know, do these kind of things where I also love their accounting of the recruitment process, where they have these big public meetings and the public officials there, and yeah, I could imagine this as an ethnographer kind of on the sidelines of this project, just writing about the project itself as an interesting object of analysis.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Different things that just made me, the way they grouped different kinds of practices also, but
And one clear thing that I think is relevant to the current multi-species stories around SARS-CoV-2 in this article is that they found that direct contact with bats was not identified as a risk factor. So there were some people that were identified in this survey as having, you know, more risky liaisons with bats, but that wasn't correlated to these self-reports of acute respiratory infection or influenza-like illness. So it's pointing to a more complicated multi-species story. You know, here's people with coronavirus. There are some people in this sample, which is large, but like our, you know, like I don't think I'll ever interview that many people in the course of my work. But yeah, the dots weren't connected, and for me, that lacuna, that space of unknowing is really interesting to say, like, okay, there's these we can kind of gesture to these complicated multi-species stories of disease emergence, but we really don't have the empirical stuff there to say anything in particular about this contact zone.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's what I found also very interesting. They rule out wild animal hunting, wild animal trade as being especially risk factors compared to but then they do, and I think if I'm not wrong, poultry traders or something is actually a risk factor. So that's interesting. But yeah, I think Frederic, is it true that no bat viruses, well, can't be none, but I mean, Hendra and Nipah both had intermediary hosts also. Isn't that correct?
No, for Nipah, it's a direct transmission by consumption of fruits.
Okay.
Malaysia. And then the sap of the tree. So it can be direct.
Okay.
If I may jump in again, I was very surprised by the second article that shows a potential transmission by pigs, and they mimic the term SARS, and they coined the term SADS, which is swine acute diarrhea syndrome. And this really reminded me of how they build the term SIV. You know, SIV is the simian immunosuppression virus. So it's one of the origins of HIV among monkeys in Africa. So this idea, I mean, first it's very probable that bad coronaviruses can go through pigs, because pigs share so many tissues with humans. But at the same time, I don't know if it's a very significant event, but I mean, in the logic of virologists themselves, it's significant, but probably in the epidemiology of viruses, of diseases, it's not very significant. So what do you think of this article?
Right, yeah, exactly. I just, when I found it, I was, to me, it's similar to what we were just saying about the sort of the absences of knowledge, that the claims that are being made immediately after this emergence about the role of wildlife trade, wild animals, that, but to me, of course, it does seem likely that it went from bats to an intermediary species, but why would it have to be a wild animal species? It seems much more likely that it would actually travel from bats to maybe a domestic animal species. I don't know, it's a possibility. At least it's something that we don't know. And here's an example of between SARS and now. So there's been everyone's like, oh, it's just like SARS, but between SARS and now there's been another coronavirus that came from bats, but it went to pigs. And that one didn't happen to spread to humans. That's also very interesting. I believe you had Alex Blanchette on earlier in the group.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because in his the big outbreak that he talks about there is also a coronavirus, right? That's yeah. I think it's interesting, and I think when the reaction in the immediate moment that, oh, this is because people in China eat really weird things, or there's some sort of unusual trade, or we should ban wildlife trade, not only internationally but also within China. That was a response of a certain sector of people, but to ignore the fact that of the role of the sort of larger scale industrial farming and just the scale of animals that has as a risk factor, even possibly in this outbreak, I think is something that shouldn't be ignored at least.
Yeah.
May I say something?
Sure.
So thank you so much. Very interesting, fascinating what you are telling us. I'm particularly interested in what you said, also because I'm Italian, I live in Italy, and I live near to Brescia and Bergamo, the cities that have been hit the most here in Italy, in the Lombardy region. And I always wonder if it's not just by coincidence that in those regions, as well as in Veneto, there are the highest concentration of farming industry. And so I don't know if you have any data about that, or you had any thought about that, also in coincidence with the fact that there are other outbreaks of COVID, in coincidence with meat industry places. So
yeah, that's an interesting issue that it's come up again also recently in Beijing. They had an outbreak associated with the market, and so there was a big outcry. Some people saying it was about Norwegian salmon, I guess, in that case, that was suspected. But ultimately, to me, I don't believe that there's any demonstration that this has been continuing to spread in animals. And in fact, I haven't seen a single report of it being found in any animal, including supposedly at the source or anything like this. So it seems to be more that it's related to these, including maybe certainly slaughterhouses, large-scale wholesale markets. They're actually similar to the kinds of things you've seen in Singapore at churches, where you've had huge outbreaks associated with churches, or then more recently, the migrant worker dormitories. So it's just about places where people are in very close contact, is my guess about that.
There are some reports of animal infection. So some experimental work has been done with cats. You got all kinds of anecdotal reports of it showing up in cats, mink farms in the Netherlands. I haven't dug deep. I dug deep into the primary literature on cats at one point. I haven't looked at the mink farms. But one thing about the paper that you, the second paper, the fatal swine flu one, I thought it interesting that they weren't able to identify the receptor that it was using to get inside of the cells. So they did demonstrate a degree of viral kinship in doing a de novo whole genome sequence, but they ruled out ACE2 as the receptor that it was using to get inside of cells. They were using HeLa cells, I guess, to do some experimental work. And there were two other receptors. I can't remember which ones they were, but I think one was the one that MERS uses. So I think it's both interesting to recognize these viral kinships, but also the heterogeneity. Like, so earlier in this group, we were looking at lateral gene transfer and the ways that when you construct phylogenetic trees along, certain segments of the genome, you're often inheriting multiple sets of ancestors with these organisms that don't do sex like, eukaryotes, but that are often just, co-inhabiting the same hosts and acquiring genomes in kind of an ad hoc way. So yeah, it was interesting for me to see that, this is a kindred virus, but I didn't, for example, see, I did a search of the paper that we read by Alexander Gorbalenya a couple of weeks ago, and it's SADS is not included in his genealogy of the species complex of beta coronaviruses, which are the broader family that the original SARS and SARS-CoV-2 are part of. So yeah, just thinking with specificities of viral genealogies, and not only like trying to think about the specificities of the whole genome, but if we're kind of thinking with John Dupre of viruses as living processes, thinking about receptor morphology and modes of interacting and being and becoming with the host, I think are critically important as we kind of drill down into the specificities of a particular pandemic, but then also to pan out and look at processes and assemblages that are engendering the conditions of possibility for disease emergence, I think is also super important. But yeah, thank you for pointing us towards these interesting articles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting about the receptors. I mean, that's another area where claims are being made about the relationship between species, basically, right? And the possibility of relations between species. So it's a kind of a key area for that.
Yeah, we looked at one paper in some detail that again had some sloppy taxonomic thinking that Stefan Helmreich pointed out. So there's one paper that just is like comparative receptor morphology of ACE2, showing that cats, like some unsurprising can, if you look at ACE2 receptor morphology, so human ACE2 receptors are similar to chimpanzees, rhesus macaques, I think cats, maybe cattle. But yeah, like some of the categories in there, like pangolin, that's actually a whole complex of heterogeneous animals that get called the common name pangolin.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah.
But do other folks? I've got more questions about these two papers. Do other folks have anything that they want to add or jump in? Just back on the other primary literature paper, the human-animal interactions one, I thought it was really interesting. They had a paragraph in there just trying to reckon with the low levels of seropositivity for the coronaviruses that they were testing for. And they had a lot of different hypotheses as to why this might be the case. And one of them, let's see, number 3, they said the limited diversity of CoVs that this study tested for. So I think like as these studies get enacted, it's like a praxeography, to use Anne-Marie Moll's term, like how is this knowledge getting constructed and enacted? And if the samples are already constraining in a pretty radical way the kinds of organism, the kind of virus that they're looking for, that's gonna very much constrain what's known. So like coronaviruses cause the common cold, and at what point do we, how are we sorting viral types, I think, and testing for them, I think, is a critical question to ask of these kinds of papers too.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that's exactly what's happened with influenza and with this, which is that the development of this larger and larger, as the sample grows, basically the archive grows, then the objects of concern start changing and shifting. really significantly. And I think that's probably what will happen here, because they've only really been doing this sampling projects for coronavirus since SARS, and they already found 10 to 20, I think. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but it's quite a few that they found from bats since that time period. But, you know, just in the past year, they found a number of new ones. And so then when you're doing a study like this, then you can only use ones, right, that we already know about, and probably they only could do a few out of those even. So that would definitely limit, I think, based on the idea of it being, there could be sort of large numbers, even more than that. But that's the vision of, from some of these global virologists, is this project, the Global Virome, where you would actually sort of be able to use, you know, those kind of the sampling techniques that, what is it called, that sample for everything within, with all the material, all the genetic material within a single sample they can isolate. And they would try to just collect sort of large, just huge, enormous archives of viruses, from starting with high-risk species like bats, and then from that use some kind of computer modeling techniques to try to identify the sources of risk and so on. But having said that, again, the critique from the sort of spatial ecology people, sort of internal within the One Health world, the critique from their point of view is that what keeps happening when we have emerging viruses is that viruses that we knew were going to be there, we knew they were going to be risky, but they emerge in a place that we didn't expect, because there was some kind of transformation in the ecology, some transformation in human practices that shifted the way that the interface is set up, and so that things emerged differently than we expected. So.
Yeah.
In other words, risk is often localized within the virus, but a lot of the risk might not be localizable within the virus.
Yeah, I found the discourse of risk to be super interesting. In that same paper, the phrase behavioral risk comes up. So the central scientific question, as they define it in this paper, what are the behavioral risks in human-animal interactions that could lead to the emergence of bat coronavirus in human population? So the localization of risk I just found to be super interesting in the way that they framed that question.
Mm-hmm. You mean localizing it around behavior? Or the
behavioral risks. And yeah, just like the specificity of localizing the risk, and you know, like, and you could like apply a Foucauldian biopolitical lens to this question, or like, you know, where, and I think, you know, biopolitics is flaccid if you follow Haraway's, you know, Cyborg Manifesto. So you know, where do we, yeah, what kinds of articulations are being done here in that framing of risk, and how could it be otherwise?
What I try to argue a little bit in the paper on wild geese is that, I mean, I feel these kind of projects, they tend to treat human practices as fixed in a certain way. Partly it's tied up with ideas about tradition, and how tradition has a sort of fixity. And the reality is that actually people are constantly doing new things. And so, I mean, they went to that lake looking for free grazing ducks, and that was something that was thought of as being a traditional Chinese farming practice. But what they found is people breeding wild geese species that they would never thought of them farming. And so, yeah, I mean, people are doing new things, and that's, I think, something that often these kind of projects, although they're interested in humans, they, through terms like behavior, I think, and it localizes it and fixes it in a way that doesn't sort of account for the changing of people's practices, including in response to some of the biosecurity interventions. Let's say we ban wildlife trade. What are 15 million people that are involved in that trade. What are they going to do? Including what are they going to do with the animals that they currently have, which is not even being addressed that much with these policies. So people are saying, well, they're going to have. So there's risks that are being created also sometimes. In that way.
So could you say more on that? Like what's going on in mainland China after, because there was a very dramatic push to ban wildlife trade. Like, do you have a sense of what's become of those animals? Has there been a mass culling, people letting animals go?
I've only followed it from secondary source, so I don't know too much from the inside, but it's from what I can tell, that there's been a halt on the trade, and there's been some exceptions are being made, because within this category of for farming wildlife, which is called special type husbandry, within that category is included a lot of species that some have been farmed for a very, very long period of time. So it could be things like frogs, quail, turkeys, just turkeys. These would all be included within the category of this so-called wildlife, but also included are tigers, bears, civet cats, which is a known risk for coronavirus. So I read one article, some of these things are being accepted and being moved into some other categorization so that they will be allowed to continue. But that's my understanding currently.
This is a tangent, but frogs are of a particular interest to me because of the chytrid epidemic. So in my mind, it's a very similar story to the coronavirus pandemic that's impacting humans, but many species like the American bullfrog, Xenopus laevis, the laboratory animal, the African clawed frog, these are asymptomatic carriers of a fungal disease that is lethal for many other amphibian species. So the global trade in amphibians is creating a mass extinction event. So do you see that circulating at all in the East Asian context or Southeast Asian?
That particular disease, I haven't followed that, no, but
yeah,
yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think I've been reading, I mean, there's very interesting debates about wildlife farming from the point of view of conservation arguments. Some people arguing that this is a key tool for conservation. Others arguing that it's actually very detrimental to conservation. So
apparently there's a lot of pangolin farming for Chinese traditional medicine.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know about that specific issue about frogs. But one thing I did read was that, another thing within wildlife trade, like there's some very industrial scale wildlife farming as well as more sort of small scale. And so what I would really advocate for is more of a kind of One Health approach towards understanding the conditions of risk in these and producing the knowledge, which is really an absence right now, rather than just the sort of outright ban across large categories.
All right. Are there other questions? This was a super interesting set of readings and really enjoyable way to spend my Monday morning here in the States.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it's really good to see everybody.
Fan, do you have any questions? You and your uncle? His first time joining us.
I don't know if my uncle wants to. We were just having some discussion last night. He has some friends who know people in Wuhan in the lab, and kind of talking about you mentioned like Christian Anderson talking about the assemblage of expertise there, but there's still just, it seems so fast that they were able to identify the sequence, and so it does seem astonishing speed.
Yeah, make life in short. For the people, we have we have been trained in China, and then we, developed our careers in America. So we know both cultures. For the scholars, Chinese scholars, they have left China, now working in America. We tend to believe this virus is caused by human. From Wuhan, biology institution for sure. Because a lot of our lines along this, conclusion is, in China, there is no ethnic problems. People are daring to do whatever they want to do. And also, sometimes they might be encouraged by their advisors in America, because those Americans really devote themselves, professors, they devote their, interest in science, but because of the limit in America, sometimes they are not able to do some experiments. So that's why they will encourage their students. Yeah, that's a good idea. Something you probably can try, something like that. Also, you can say it's a take advantage of loose management in China. And another thing is lab management. It's not as solid as in America because of there is no fear. So in America, we will, have a sort of, bottom line, something you can't touch. For example, bats. I have friends, they are the leading scholars study bats for the auditory system. But they knew bats carry so many, virus or something. It is very, easy to lose control because this virus might cross species. Not only if you try to do your, mutant genesis and knock in something, but anyway, so that's what, at the very beginning, I have friends ask me, have you ever think about it? This is, probably we tend to think it's, even, they don't know where this, virus, leaked out. Because as I said, also these, people really don't pay attention about that. Most of my friends right now, all these professors in the science field, we had a feeling, especially for these new, come students or postdocs, they somehow, even they are working in, America, but they don't follow this regulation closely. My friend complained, his student say, I used to have a, no problem at all. Since this guy came, I have a lot of troubles. And then eventually he asked him, how did you sterilize, all our, beakers, flasks, something like that? Because in their regulation, their protocol, they say you have to wash them 3 times or something like that. And then he sort of, asked him, what you did? He said, okay, I just reduced, I only wash once or twice. Why bother 3 times? That's something happened. It's pretty often in China. We won't feel strange if it happens. That's why I say, that's something, it's not intended, to leak out, but it's just, by mistake. So I think, when, okay, I'm sorry, I just stopped over here. That's from my side of the view,
But I guess some of the discussion does remind me of what Eben has probably written in his new book, talking about the whole environment in which the CRISPR experimentation emerged. So I thought there was a little bit of connection there.
Thanks for sharing.
I know we're out of time, so didn't want to keep you guys.
Yeah. Thanks.
It's very interesting, to listen your discussion.
Thanks for visiting. Yeah, and we'll see. We've got a number of interesting authors we're talking about with future events. I mentioned Warwick Anderson, historian based at University of Sydney. We've also got some researchers based in Southern California who've been tracking coronavirus in the prison system in the United States, looking at issues of race and inequality. Yeah, so lots of interesting papers in the queue. Please send me your paper. Let's discuss it. And yeah, there's also at a certain point, Rob Dunn and Salas Ariola will be talking about kind of a resurgence of microbiophilia. So people who are excited about microbes again. So people who are baking sourdough bread. Rob is a microbiologist, and he's consulting with some space exploration initiatives right now to think about microbes in space. So we've got a couple of tangents coming up in the future as well. But yeah, good to see you all again. It seems like viral clouds are lifting. I said that in the beginning, and yeah, be safe, everyone, and see you soon. See you next week.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Eben.
Yeah, thanks, Lisette.
Bye.
And Frederic, if you and Lyle want to stay on, maybe we could have a quick chat.
Sure.
Ciao.
Ciao. Let me stop the recording.